And that seems always to be true.
Yep.
And yet, at the same time, the Germans really, by what they did to Rotterdam and Warsaw and Coventry, they sowed the wind. And
that's what Arthur Harris said. He said when he was up on the roof of the Air Ministry looking at London on fire in the autumn of 1940, he said they're sowing the wind and they will reap the whirlwind. And he is absolutely right. The development of the bomber offensive is interesting, particularly in the light of current arguments in the UK, which it's moved on. In the immediate, during the war, this is a waste of resources.
Yeah.
The money we spend building a strategic force should be spent on a tactical force to support the armies or destroy the submarine. Then it became, the argument was, well, it didn't achieve anything, that German industrial production increased. In spite of this destruction of their industrial cities, they actually got stronger. But the argument today is a moral argument. It's not that it was a waste of resources and ineffective, but it was morally flawed. It shouldn't have been waged at all. And that's the one that keeps this flame burning underneath Arthur Harris and his boys.
Let me ask you a question about that goes to the moral question. And it's seemingly a very immoral question in itself. I seem to recollect that after Pearl Harbor was bombed on December 7th, about December 20th or 21st or 22nd, Churchill delivered a speech before the American Congress. And in that speech, he very unforgettably said, speaking of the Japanese, but clearly it implied the Germans as well. He spoke of the Japanese because it was they who had attacked us. He said, what kind of people do they think that we are? Do they think we will not rest until they have been taught a lesson which they and the world will never forget? You know, and went on. And that motivated, did it not, both Churchill and Roosevelt to a large extent in this bomber war, because as you point out, all of Germany's previous aggressive wars, Austria and Denmark in the 60s, France in 1871, France and Belgium in the First World War, the attack into Poland and into France, attacks plural, into Poland and into France. And Germany had never tasted war on its own soil, and this really brought it home to Germany. I've seen pictures of Harry Truman in a car going through Berlin, and you know, it makes New Orleans today look like there's nothing the matter with it.
Right.
So, I mean, this had a major, this was would you agree, let me put it out, would you agree that this was a major reason behind, underlying in some people's minds at the top levels of government, the destruction of the German cities?
Yes, I think so. I don't know whether it was a reason for doing it. It was a military campaign and fought for military reasons. But undoubtedly one of the spin-offs from it was that it changed the mind of the German people. When the war, their attitude towards Hitler began to change in 1943 when the Allied bomber offensive built up, when night after night and day after day, when the Mustang came in, the skies over Germany were filled with bombers and destruction rained down on a daily, nightly basis. And it went on for years. And I think quite seriously that the German people, which are now one of the most pacific people, which is a complete reversal of the way they were since the end of the Napoleonic Wars, must have something to do with the fact that when war comes home, suddenly war isn't glorious anymore.
And wouldn't that also be true of what happened in Japan? And the Japanese too became a very pacific people.
Again, I'm not, I don't normally go east of Suez, so I wouldn't know. But yes, I suspect so. It certainly would change the minds of most people who have experienced war, don't want any more of it. And I think it must have happened to the fascist powers as much as it would to the democratic powers.
You know, I really believe, I don't imagine this is the most popular thing an American can say in America, but I really think that one of the reasons why America has fought so many wars since the end of World War II, and we fought something like 7 or 8 major wars and another 10 or 15 more minor ones, is that not since the American Civil War has there been a war on American soil. Americans, and after the Civil War, by the way, for 50 years or so, America was a very pacific country. The military was in bad odor in the United States from about 1865 to 1917. People wanted no part of it. Not since then has there been a war fought on our soil. I don't think we really, George Bush, what does he know about a war? You know, when you get right down to it. Well, explain why, if you would, some of the concrete reasons why when the bombers first started going over Europe, and for that matter, when the German bombers first started going over Britain, why these bombing attacks failed, the flak, the fighter defense, and so on.
Oof, well, largely a failure of to provide them with the necessary technical aids. They couldn't find the target, essentially. To roam across the continent of Europe, trying to find Germany, never mind Essen and
Can I interject something? You tell the story about how British pilots and navigators in peacetime, before the war, flying over Britain, had to land to find out where they were. They couldn't find their own cities in Britain. I mean, what is with these people? And they think they're going to find Essen?
Oh yes, and that was continually pointed out to the powers that be in Whitehall. You know, we've got to develop some better aids. They didn't often land. What they would do is fly. It was called flying by Bradshaw. Bradshaw being the railway guy. That you'd fly down, and with your binoculars, you would say, "Ah, that's Birmingham. Okay, well Coventry's back there somewhere, and if we keep going north, then that must be Manchester." And there I give a number of accounts of how bombing exercises fell apart because the bombers simply got lost. And that went on frequently through to about end of 42 anyway, when we, the RAF, began to get the necessary technical aids. But it was a disaster. We had a report published at the end of 1941, the famous Butt report. A civil servant called Mr. Butt was invited to examine the results of RAF bombing operations, and came up with the conclusion that on a good night, with any luck, the average bomber dropped his bombs within 5 miles of the target, and progressively further away as the night became less attractive. It was quite interesting when I wrote the book. I went to Germany with the Bomber Command war diaries in one hand, and would go to the archives in Cologne and Ludwigshafen, Mannheim, other cities, and say, okay, it says here on such and such a night, there's bombers attack, fires widespread, and what have you got? And they would produce the police president's report and said, chicken shed hit on outskirts of city, no other damage reported.
You know, and then you point out that the flak was extraordinarily heavy. That the bombers, before the P-51 came in, which could accompany the bombers all the way to the target, they were getting shot down like crazy by the fighters. And the thing that it's just so fascinating to see, because we repeated it in Vietnam in a different genre, so to speak, is that the bombers would report that they shot down, for example, and given 50 German fighters, the Germans had 2 fighters shot down. It was like the Vietnam body count. It wasn't completely phony. So we had to explain why the Americans thought that they would be able to ward off the swarms of German fighters.
Well, they had created a bomber force to do just that. I mean, it was self-defending, because no fighter then in service in the start of the war could accompany the bombers all the way to the target and all the way back. It was necessary for a bomber formation to defend themselves. And they did this by filling them with gunners. You know, top gunner, rear gunner, belly gunner, forward gunner, waist gunner.
12 machine guns in an airplane.
Well, and then they would fly in very tight, self-defending formations. But when the United States entered the war and the bombers started to fly across to Britain, a few of those bombers missed Britain and landed on the continent. They landed at Schiphol. They were lost. So the Germans rapidly acquired, I don't know how many, but several B-17s, B-17E, the one without the chin turret. So they took it off and they flew it around, and the Luftwaffe pilots discovered that the best way to attack these bomber formations was head-on. The machine guns were designed to protect to the flank and to the rear, but if you attacked head-on from 12 o'clock high up there with cannon, you would, one, kill the pilots, and you would break up the bomber formation, and you could pick off individual bombers one by one. It took a lot of nerve, but Luftwaffe pilots were not short of nerve. And that's what they did. And
then ultimately, they also started from what we would call 6 o'clock low, because there was another undefended area.
That's right. Well, you had the belly time.
You know, people don't realize, I think, Rod, how fantastically dangerous it was to be to fly in a bomber in World War II. What were some of the statistics, if you remember them, on the losses in the RAF and in the United States 8th Air Force?
In the RAF Bomber Command, the losses were 55%.
55%.
There were about 100,000 air crew, and 51,000 were killed. Then another 7,000 were killed in training, and a lot more were shot down and captured, about
Yeah.
7,000 were captured.
Yeah.
In the 8th Air Force, losses are not fully up to speed on those. I think it averaged out at about 28%.
Yeah,
It's a shorter
and,
war.
and the 8th Air Force was only in action about half the time the RAF, so on a per year basis, you know,
Yeah.
and they would lose 8 and 10 and sometimes 19 and 20% of a bombing armada on a given night.
Yeah.
And 3 and 4% was considered acceptable. Well, hey, 4%, if you have 25 missions, your number's up.
Well, yeah, and the RAF had 30 missions
Yeah.
in the first tour. Then you'd have 6 months off. Then you go back for another 30 missions.
Yeah.
Your chances of surviving
Yeah.
were quite small.
Yeah, and
Just
the Americans
statistically.
finally, because they were losing men, pilots and so forth, they increased it from 25 missions to 35 missions. So if somebody got killed in the 32nd mission, well, that's just a casualty of the increase, I guess. We have to take another break. We'll be right back. Stay with us. We'll be right back with more from Robin Neillands.
Hey, yo, Tim, get on your job, kid. We got school, yo. I see you in the window, man. You want me to do? I got the bus here, man. I got connections. We holding up traffic. Let's go. I'm not letting you waste your life like that, yeah.
What inspired David to spend a lifetime exploring distant planets?
Star Trek.
What inspired Nicole to bring new life into the world?
The first time I saw St. Elsewhere.
And what inspired Stephen to risk his life for others?
Hill Street Blues.
Television. Who will it inspire next?
You know how inquisitive kids are. That's why you store sharp objects in a safe place. Keep medicines out of reach. And if you have a gun, you keep it unloaded and locked away. As concerned members of the television community, we urge you to be just as careful with television. Kids don't always know what they're watching. That's why you should.
I'm a lion!
Yes, you are. Come here. Let's see how this looks.
Hey, how's my little horse?
She's a lion.
Yes, she is.
You don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. When you adopt a child from foster care, just being there makes all the difference.
Rob, you were saying during the intermission, I just want to point out to people, that apparently the only service that had a greater loss than RAF Bomber Command were the Nazi U-boat command with a loss of 90%.
Yep.
Wow, wow. Rob, it was thought, was it not, that, at least early in the war, that strategic bombing would destroy the enemy's morale. Why was that thought, and what was the evidence for or against it?
Very little evidence for it, let alone in the UK. I mean, Hitler's idea when they decided to call off Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, he'd been assured by Goering that the German bombers alone could pound the British into submission, and it didn't work. We had the Blitz, 79 nights, London was bombed straight off. Other cities were bombed, cathedral cities, not just industrial cities. And if anything, I was only, 6 at the time, had no effect whatsoever. If anything, we became remarkably bloody-minded about it,
Yeah.
and we were not going to give in to that lot up there. Britain can take it, that was the sign.
Right.
So there was no real evidence. that a bomber offensive would do much to destroy the morale of the German civilians. It hadn't destroyed our morale. There's no reason to believe it would destroy their morale. And I don't believe it did. I think that the Germans went about their business as we went about our business. Went to the factory, went queuing, fed the kids, wrote to the husband at the front.
Yep.
Life went on.
Yep, yep, yep. I remember there's one famous story, Rob, about because the East End is where the docks were in London. And so that got bombed a lot. And one day, Buckingham Palace got hit by a bomb, and the Queen, did she not, said, "Now I can look the East End in the face."
Absolutely.
Something on that order. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so morale, they would talk about morale, but that was a non-starter when you got right down to it. How about crippling Germany's war-making capacity?
Well, that was one of the arguments raised at the end of the war. I think there is limited evidence that it damaged Germany's war-making capacity. But then what you have to do, and it made the point where we were talking about academic rigor in studying history, not just reading it. Why was this? Well, there were a number of reasons. The first thing was that the Nazi philosophy was based on keeping the women in the kitchen and the kids in the school. So Germany only ran one shift a day in the factories until the end of 1943.
Yeah, they're fighting the whole world, and they have only one shift a day.
One shift a day, yeah. They didn't use their own workers, they used slave labor, imported labor from the East and from France. All the occupied countries were supposed to supply workers. And forced labor is inefficient labor. Yeah. The man who made the difference was Albert Speer. Yeah. And he put on an extra shift. That doubled in Germany's industrial production. And by that time they were organized. They had what we would have called shadow factories. They'd moved the main component factories, aircraft factories, tank factories, either underground or to the east, where we couldn't get at them. So basically the war was the Germans' industrial production from 1943 on was being handled by a genius in the shape of Albert Speer. So in fact their production capacity increased, though with rather obsolescent marks of aircraft, but greatly improved tanks, and they brought in the jet fighter and so on.
They increased by almost sixfold their supply, their annual production of tanks. Unbelievable.
I know. Yeah. But then they ran out of fuel. You see, this was the the grand weakness in the German economy was they had no natural supplies of fuel. They could produce it from coal, synthetic fuel. But when they lost the Romanian oil fields, that really was the doom of the Nazi regime.
I'm going to come to that in a second. The one thing that has fascinated me, you said in the book that the Germans in 1944 and 1945 produced something like, I think it was 1,400 Messerschmitt jet aircraft. The Messerschmitt jet airplane was a wonder for its day. And we couldn't do anything about it in the air, so you say we would bomb the runway so they couldn't take off or land. But, they can always repair runways. The Japanese did that and so on. Why was the Messerschmitt so ineffective in terms of stopping the Allied bombing armada?
Well, first of all, the armadas were huge. I mean, I opened the book with an account from an American Air Force crew member who recalls on this day in, I think, early 45, he climbed up into looked out the cockpit blister, and there were 1,400 bombers flying to Germany that day. Wow. Colossal number. Wow. The sky was black with bombers. Wow. What damaged the effectiveness of the jet fighter was there was no place to train the crews. I mean, this was a lot of Luftwaffe pilots had been killed. It was a new kind of aircraft. It took some pretty careful handling. They didn't have the experience. They'd lost the war. It came too late. And Hitler mucked about with the development of the 262, the ME-262, and prevented. He wanted a bomber. He mucked about with a fighter, and it didn't work.
Rob, was one purpose served by the strategic bombing campaign to buck up the morale of the British public and to buck up the morale, as it were, of the Russians?
Yes, indeed. I mean, for 4 years, until 6th of June 44, other than in North Africa, the only way we could carry the war to the enemy was with the bomber. It was the way of hitting at his industrial resources, and of course giving support to the Russians, who thought the land war in Europe was very largely a Russian affair, if you add it all up. Russia took the weight of the land war in Europe. But what we gave him was tremendous support in writing down Germany's ability to produce weapons of war.
Again, Americans celebrate Normandy, we celebrate the campaign against France. It tends to be forgotten that the Russians lost 20 million people, and there are ideas abroad these days that maybe it was 60 million, and just a lot of them didn't get counted. And that was the land war on the Eastern Front, and that's where, in terms of the land war, that's where the battle was won or lost. It was a huge grinder of German men and equipment and so forth. Incidentally, that was one of the reasons for bombing Dresden, was it not?
It was. It was, again, this business, it's in the book.
Yes.
To look at why we bombed Dresden, why did we leave it so late. It all harks back to a request from the Russians to destroy German communication centers in Saxony and Eastern Germany: Chemnitz, Leipzig, Berlin, and Dresden. And a look at the map, you will see that the railway lines all converge on those 4 points.
Yeah.
And what the Russians wanted was to stop the movement of German forces from the west to the east before they crossed the River Oder and advanced into Germany.
Yeah, yeah. They had something, the Germans had something like 3 or 4 million men at one point on the Eastern Front, did they not?
They did, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, which is far more, I think, than they ever had in the West, as far as I know.
Well, the Western forces built up, but what was worrying the German High Command in 45, time of the Dresden raid, was that they were fairly willing to give ground in the West to the reasonably civilized armies of Britain, Canada, and the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
But the German army, the Russian army had already raped its way across Eastern Europe,
Yeah,
and they
yeah.
didn't want
Yeah.
to happen what did happen, of course, when the Russian armies entered Germany.
Yeah, yeah. In these days, for the last 5 or 10 years, a fellow, due to the efforts of a writer named Sebald, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name right, who recently died. You know, there's this kind of reassessment going on in Germany. Well, people forgot about what we, the Germans, suffered. Hey, you know, make me bleed for you, why don't you? It's kind of the attitude of people like myself, I guess. You pointed out, I'd like you to elaborate on it. What was the role of strategic and/or tactical bombing in the last year of the war in destroying Germany's ability to make war because of destruction of oil, transportation, and so forth?
Right, we have to go back a bit. At the end of 43, Arthur Harris went to see Churchill and said, in effect, if you can get me the US 8th Air Force, we will bomb Germany round the clock, and we will win this war, and the invasion of Europe will not be necessary. And he started on his own, without the 8th Air Force, what became known as the Battle of Berlin, which went on through the winter of 43 into 44, and until the Allied strategic bomber forces, 8th and the Bomber Command, were taken away and put under Eisenhower to prepare for the build-up of the invasion. Harris was wrong. There was no way that we were going to destroy Berlin. It's a huge city, 500 square miles. And I don't believe the argument that even if we'd been able to destroy Berlin, the Germans would have jacked it in.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a totalitarian state.
Yeah.
Hitler wasn't going to surrender, and he was a man that counted.
Yeah,
So it
anybody
wasn't
who
going to
taught
work.
surrender, they'd hang from a lamppost.
Precisely.
Yeah.
So we then move on to the Normandy campaign. That was no problem. So from about the April of 44 through to the September, the strategic air forces were under Eisenhower, and it used effectively as tactical air force.
Yeah.
Then they were handed back to Tui Spatz and to Harris, and told to get on with whatever they were doing before. And again, I've said in the book, at that point I think Harris was wrong. He reverted to attacking the industrial cities of Germany, whereas Spatz said, there was an argument that sprung up in higher quarters, that the two targets worth attacking were oil and transportation. Oil, because nothing moves without oil, and transportation, you had to move the oil about.
Yeah.
And I think that was right. Harris had been in post then for 2.5 years. He had to launch his forces every night. That's a long time to stay in post as a senior commander. I think he was tired.
Yeah.
In fact, I went to a doctor and said, here is a man of a certain age. He has chronic stomach ulcers. He's become very irascible. He's sticking to a point. He's very dogmatic. He's falling out with his friends. What's the matter with him? And I won't tell you who he is. And they said, well, he needs a break. You know, he needs a lead. I think he should have gone to the Far East and looked after the deployment of the RAF to the Far East after the European war ended. Yeah. But he stayed in post, and he fought the war through to the end, and I think within his lights he did what he thought was right, but I think strategically he was actually wrong.
Yeah. One of the things that surprises me, I had not known about the bombing, of the strategic bombing, as it were, at the breakout of Saint-Lô. until I read a book by a great American literateur, you might say, called Paul Fussell, who was
Yeah.
an infantryman. And he pointed out that when we got stopped, they brought in, 500 bombers as if it were a city, and they plastered an area of the German lines to such an extent that the great irony was that some German soldiers committed suicide to get out of this horror. And indeed, an American general who had trained a lot of the men dug in a mile behind the lines, and because of mistakes, all they ever found of him was his shirt collar. How come we didn't do more of this kind of tactical bombing, that using the strategic bombing air force? Because after that, some of our men had gotten hit at first. After that, just walked through them.
Well, because it didn't work, that's why. Not a few men were killed in that bombing in July. I think it was the 25th of July. About 600 American soldiers were killed in that bombing. And that was the problem. When I wrote my book on the Battle of Normandy, there are lots of accounts in there. I don't know how many Allied soldiers were killed by bombing and our air forces in the Battle of Normandy, but it must have run into thousands, because hardly any account, American, Canadian, British, is without saying we were attacked by bombers, we were strafed by fighters. It was dangerous. There was a classic example on one attack on the Caen Plain, where the British were preparing to advance with the support of Harris's bombers, and it was decided that to mark out the extent of the British lines, they should mark their forward positions with yellow smoke. Unfortunately, yellow smoke markers were used by the RAF in daylight to mark ground targets. So there you are, you're flying along, you look down, yellow smoke, that must be the target. And they bombed their own troops. It happened all the time. It was dangerous.
One thing that, and not since I read Don Miller's revision, wholesale revision, of a book on the history of World War II written by Commager in 1946. Miller's book is around 2000. Have I read, until your book, a book which uses long quotes, which people normally skip over, but one should not skip them in your book or in Miller's book, because they're just wonderful. How did you go about finding these veterans whose quotes you use?
I wish I could remember. It was well, Judy and I came, my wife Judy and I come to the United States every year. We love it here. And we wrote umpteen letters to veteran organizations, local newspapers. We tracked it through organizations in the UK who have links with American people. And we met some fantastic people. I mean, I'm glad you raised that, because that book is full of oral accounts, written accounts, by American 8th Air Force veterans.
Also RAF guys.
And RAF guys, and Canadians, Australians.
Even Germans.
Even Germans, lots of Germans, when I could find them. We went to Germany to interview Luftwaffe pilots. And that's very important, because they were the guys at the sharp end. I'm not interested in the muck and bullets bit. History is only interested to me when it involves people, and particularly when it involves ordinary people. And I have to say, one of the reasons why I have become a stout advocate of Harris and the Veterans of Bomber Command is I take deep exception to a nation that can send its young men, 19, 20, 21, out to fight their wars, and 50 years later, when they're old men, turn on them and call them villains. I resent that. I won't have that.
Rob, we have to wrap it up. Thank you for coming. I hope you have a good trip back on the QM.
We're looking forward to it. Thanks for asking me.
In the old days, it used to be the QE2. Now it's the QM.
QM2, yeah. We love it.
To the audience, be with us again for the next installment of Books of Our Time.